Davis steps under center. Gibson and McClendon behind him. Davis with motion by Richard. Will give the ball to McClendon. He leaps. Oh, he doesn't get in. He fumbled the football. Carolina holds. The game is over. And Carolina has won the game.
Finley to throw. Over the middle, intercepted. Wolford again. Wolford the other way at the 30, the 40. Wolford to midfield. Miles Wolford with the pick. The heels on the doorstep of an enormous victory.
Left side of the line. Hood standing to Williams' right. Williams gonna throw. One-on-one. Davis has it. Touchdown. Carolina wins. Carolina is the Coastal Division champion. Bernard fields it at the 26. Heading to the far side. Gio at the 35. Gio is at the 50. No, he's not. Yes, he is. Gio is going to take it for a touchdown. Are you kidding me? Connor Barth for the possible win. Snap, spot, kick away, high enough, long enough. It's good! It's good! Carolina has won the game on a 42-yard field goal by freshman Connor Barth. Good gosh, dirty!
This is the Heel Tough Blog Podcast. Hey guys, and welcome in to another edition of the Heel Tough Blog Podcast. It is Anthony Pagnotta back with you, and no, we are not doing another edition of the Quarantine Interview Series just yet. You guys have to wait until Sunday for that to come out, but we have to get on here tonight and talk about the commitments of two huge prospects for the Tar Heels. They landed them today, and we wanted to give you some immediate reaction to the commitments of 2021 four-star linebacker Raneiria Dillworth, as well as 2021 three-star offensive guard Jared Wilson. And to do that, here with me is Zack. And first of all, we do want to just check up and see how you're doing through all this. We haven't talked since everything happened with the coronavirus outbreak. So how are you and your family holding up right now during what is just an unprecedented time in the history of the United States?
Yes, I'm doing well. Able to work from home and do everything with that. So myself, my friends, my family, for the most part, are doing well. Like you mentioned, it's a pretty unprecedented time in the United States and in the world at large. So, a lot of people struggling, a lot of people having a tough time. So, we on the podcast do want to give, our thoughts and prayers to that at this time. But, more specifically to the world of recruiting, we've seen things kind of take a standstill. I mean, the whole spring recruiting is essentially gone. Summer's up in the air. The season's even up in the air, right, to some degree. So, there's a lot of fluidity to what we're seeing right now, and that's no different, in the world of recruiting. To some extent, we've seen kids extended out, and, more specifically to the Tar Heels, we've seen some, prized in-state prospects decide they wanted to jump on board.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened today. The Tar Heels, of course, were expecting the commitment of 2021 four-star linebacker Raneiria Dillworth, as we told you, and we're kind of giving you updates on throughout the week. This came after just kind of a roller coaster commitment or recruitment for him, I should say, where he went from pretty much saying he was going to commit but wouldn't announce officially until May 9th. He said that back in about February. Then in mid-March said he was going to push his decision back, but decided just a couple of weeks ago that he was going to go ahead and go through with his decision. Actually, about a week ago made that known and was going to announce it via live stream. That turned into what was eventually a surprise commitment from one of his buddies. But let's talk about Raneiria Dillworth first. And this was a guy that when we go back and if people have been following along with us here throughout this offseason, when we did the podcast where we talked about the 2021 class, and we really turned our focus there after the 2020 class became final, and we talked about our favorite prospects, this was the guy that topped your list. And for a while, his recruitment was kind of all over the place. The Tar Heels had an early lead. Then Alabama made a huge push, actually ended up taking the lead in a lot of people's minds. And then Carolina, with a late push, actually ended up taking over again. And now they land his commitment. In your mind, how big of a commitment is this for the Tar Heels, and what does this do for their 2021 class?
Well, as we've said previously here on the podcast, and as you mentioned, he was number one on my board in the 2021 class for the Tar Heels, and that's still the case as of today. I think he is an absolutely incredible prospect. And, looking through his various list of finalists, from his top 5 to his top 2, with schools like Alabama and Georgia in the mix, 2 schools that are known for producing high-quality linebackers, that should tell you in and of itself, this kid is a legit linebacker prospect. I mean, he just flies all over the field. He's a, triple-digit tackle guy at the high school level. Yep. Really just crazy, and has a lot of positional versatility as well, which is key to the Jay Bateman defense. Can rush the passer, can play, in the middle of the field as a true linebacker, run stuff, but then drop back into coverage. Really gives you a whole bunch of options, and I'm almost positive that's exactly how this Tar Heel defensive staff is going to use him. As you mentioned, had narrowed his list down to 3 finalists of UNC, Alabama, UGA, South Carolina, and NC State. Really only got to visit 2 of those before, everything shut down. Only got to visit North Carolina and Alabama. With that Alabama visit, they did make a pretty big push. That's one of their big things in their recruiting, is getting kids on campus. Same with Clemson, same with UNC, same with a lot of these schools. If they can get you on campus, they'll get some momentum there. So Alabama definitely had some momentum, and even, had a lead for a period of time. Thought there was going to be, a commitment, a silent commitment, and then an announcement later on. Obviously, that didn't happen. Broadened it out a little bit, then narrowed it back down to those 2, and obviously, as we saw today, committed to the Tar Heels. So, I think it's, as we mentioned, just the way that he fits into the Jay Bateman defense, I think that was probably one of the biggest selling factors in terms of the fact that we'll use you all over the field and use you anywhere within the, this new UNC defense. But I think it's also the familiarity, and that's what we've heard a lot from a lot of these in-state kids, is really the UNC staff is, broadcasting, we want to get the majority of our kids from in-state. We think that this is a state that has, that produces high-quality prospects and that can compete for ACC titles and national championships. And I think that's resonated with a lot of these kids. And Dillworth was definitely one of them. I think that, from what I've heard, he's got a lot of really close family connections. He's really close with his family, and that definitely played a role here in leading him to decide, that his best option was to stay close to home and play for the Tar Heels.
Building a fence around the state of North Carolina was one of the things that Mack Brown really focused on when he came back and was talking in his introductory press conference even about what they wanted to do in the state of North Carolina. And, it was one thing to say it at the time, and, he really showed some great progress in 2019, bringing that class back from one that was rated in the high 80s at one point when everybody kind of decommitted, which was expected anyways. To even getting it to where he got it in 2020, which was a really good spot for him. But this is, I think, starting to show exactly what he had in mind, which is pretty much when there is a chance that a team can come in and walk in and take a prospect that you really want, you're going to find a way late in the process to buckle down and find a way to steal that commitment back into your hands and keep that player home. That's what they did with Dillworth, because I'm going to be honest, there was a time just about a month ago where I wrote an article about the most important remaining targets in the class, and Dillworth was number 10 on the list because you just didn't get the feeling that that things were going in the right direction for Carolina. You kind of felt like, from everything that we were hearing, Bryce Steele was going to be the guy that they were going to take out of the 2, because they felt that Dillworth was really trending towards Alabama. They just felt that there was more communication between the Bama staff and him than there was between the Tar Heel staff and them at the time. And that was kind of where I had him as well. I was pretty much chalking it up where I knew they would try to make a push, but in my mind, I was saying, okay, we've got to kind of look somewhere else just in case. And you got to hand it to the staff. They really fought back to get a guy that, like you said, really fits what this defense needs. And I know that they've got a guy in Gabe Stevens who kind of fits that same role in this class. We know that, Gabe Stevens has played everywhere from defensive end to linebacker, even to corner his first year. And I still think that might be his position to fit, but this also allows them to potentially be able to move him elsewhere around in this defense. There's been some rumors that he's a good enough pass rusher, a smart enough guy, that if they put the amount of weight that is necessary, probably somewhere, he's never really going to be as big as some of these other guys, but if they could get him probably to about 240 or maybe 245, they could probably use him there. This allows them to be able to use some of that creativity because Dillworth, we talked about him when you were really breaking him down as to why he was your number one guy. He's got a little bit of that Isaiah Simmons type of player. And again, we're not trying to say that he is Isaiah Simmons. That is a humongous comparison. That's a guy that's probably about to go top 5 in the NFL draft. It's really a guy that's almost transcending and building a position on defenses, especially at the college level. But this is the new thing that you're going to start to see become really popular throughout college football, is this position of a guy that can do everything from rush the passer to cover in space. And we've seen guys like that before, but usually it's more of your middle linebacker who can kind of hold his own in space. This is a guy that has good enough coverage ability that they could pass as a safety. And, we kind of got a glimpse of it this past year with Dominique Ross, but I feel like Dillworth has a higher ceiling than Ross. I feel like he's a guy that's is a little bit better in coverage. His short area quickness is much better. If you turn on his film, when he's got unbelievable straight line speed, as witnessed by the 4.35 40. You don't really need to know much more about that. But the short area quickness, just to be able to make up a lot of space really quickly, that's the thing that I think is really important when you talk about linebackers. And it's one of the things that when I talked about the guy that I really valued in this class that the Tar Heels have committed, in Power Echols, I talk so much about it because it helps you to where if you make a little bit of a mistake reading something, you have so much speed that you can find a way to make it up and still get back into a gap to be able to make a tackle. And that's something that Dillworth can do. He's a good tackler in open space as well. There's just so many things to like about him. And now, you got to think about this. The Tar Heels in this class, we know that they're going to lose Chaz Surratt. I don't think they're going to end up losing Jeremiah Gemmel after this next year because, Jeremiah is a good player, but I just don't think he has that upside to go ahead and leave early to go to the NFL. But this is still a position the Tar Heels are pretty thin at in terms of linebacker. I think this is huge. You land two guys that right now are not only some of the best players in the state of North Carolina, they are two of the best linebackers in the entire country. And these are not two guys that are, near the top of the rankings and are dropping. Both guys are trending up as we go throughout the ratings process. Both guys had an increase in the last ratings from 24/7 Sports as they continue to trend up. So these are two guys that are growing near elite prospects, already 4-star guys. I don't think either one of them will probably reach 5-star status, but this is huge. And now, just from, at least from my perspective, I could not be more excited about the future of the linebacker position. Something that, I don't know about you, I really haven't felt this probably since the Quan Sturdivant, Bruce Carter, Zack Brown, Kevin Reddick type days.
Well, it's definitely been a while, and even through some of the, in more recent history, the Larry Fedora era, it was really one of the positions that was criticized often in relation to the run defense and then, short passes over the middle, everything along those lines. You bring, like we've mentioned numerous times, you bring in these superior athletes here in the position, you really solidify each position of your defense. You see that difference on the field. And I think we started to see a little bit that this past season, but you add in these athletes, you develop them at each level as opposed to stacking them one over the other, what have you. You can see the difference. And I feel like these two guys, as you mentioned, are both difference makers. Guys that are rising in the rankings. Guys that really, fit, that are complementary. If you want to, in a 3-4 system, generally you have those two inside linebackers playing on the field at one time. Mm-hmm. In the dime, you'll have one, and you can, switch out as needed. But you have Dillworth that's probably would be considered more of a coverage linebacker, where you have Power Eccles that you probably consider more in the box as a little bit more physical. But obviously they can do both real well, and they really complement each other, and you can rotate them as needed and use them both. So, if you're looking for an inside linebacker haul in the 2021 class, I think it's going to be hard to beat, these two that North Carolina already have on the board.
Yeah, no, and there is still a chance that they can go out and get some other guys. I know, look, Bryce Steele is going to announce his commitment tomorrow. He was a guy that the Tar Heels were closely tied to for a while. I know he's now listed as an inside linebacker, but I know from my perspective, and I'd be interested to hear what you think, I don't see him as an inside linebacker. I think he has good enough coverage skills because he's played a lot of safety to where you could probably you're probably going to use him in a similar role that you would to Dillworth. And I think that's why, because I've seen a lot of people sort of questioning, why have the Tar Heels sort of grown away from him? What is happening? Is this on the Tar Heel side? Is this on the Steel side? I think it's kind of a little bit of both, but I would lean more towards the Tar Heel side of things, just because they're looking at it as they had to kind of make a decision between two prospects here already, with a guy in Gabe Stevens, who we talked about earlier, who's committed already in the class, and a couple other guys that are still going to be there, like Kadri Jackson, who kind of fits that role as well and is probably going to play that role this year, and Eugene Asante is another one who could play that role. Those types of guys are already there, and you bring in these other two guys. I think that's where they kind of had to make a decision and kind of tell Steele also, like, look, we're not trying to bring you in here and kind of handcuff you and make you have to battle for through a bunch of different guys. If there's a better fit for you, I like South Carolina, which is where most people see him now. But to me, Carolina goes with Dillworth, I think, over Steele. They make the decision. It's a tough one. I'm not going to say that Bryce Steele is not a talented player. I watched this film. There's a lot to like about him. But out of the two guys, I think Dillworth's probably got the higher ceiling, fits the defense just a little bit better. I think, honestly, Carolina, it goes with the right decision here. In your eyes, what did you think of Bryce Steele? Is he a guy that you think could still be in play for Carolina, maybe if they use him at inside linebacker, or do you feel like he's just too similar to Dillworth in terms of fit that it's probably the right move that Carolina is going to end up watching him go to South Carolina?
Well, I think to that question in particular, I do want to say first, like you, that he is a very good, prospect, either at linebacker, inside, outside linebacker, or safety. Right. I think he has the versatility to really do any of those. I think that you could add some weight to him and play him inside, maybe a smaller inside linebacker, but still an inside linebacker. But if you have one spot that you have to fit, and it's between Raneiria Dillworth or Bryce Steele, I'm probably choosing Raneiria Dillworth 9 times out of 10 for that. Not to say, like you said, that Bryce Steele is a bad prospect in any stretch of the imagination. He's certainly a good prospect.
Right.
But, in this class specifically, there's limited spots. There's only so many, inside linebackers you can take, and, there were decisions that were made. One other wrinkle that I think could be a piece of it is the fact that Bryce Steele is coming off of injury. I believe a leg injury that kept him out a good deal, if not all of his junior season. So, that's going to play a factor in how schools evaluate you and evaluate risk versus reward in terms of taking your commitment. So, I think it was a little bit on both parties. To my understanding, the linebacker depth at South Carolina is even more thin than it is at North Carolina. So I think there's a lot of factors that would be appealing for both parties for Bryce Steele to choose South Carolina in the end. Now, in terms of prediction, never say never. Things could be vastly different. Things can change. These are, 17 to 18-year-old kids that are making these decisions, so things are very fluid. I don't think it's going to be North Carolina. I think it will be South Carolina, but, never say never in these situations.
Yeah, I agree with you. All the crystal balls really are saying that too. You've seen really once they knew his commitment was coming, Dillworth got a lot of crystal balls to Carolina, and most of those same guys that were predicting him to go to Carolina were predicting Bryce Steele to go to South Carolina, which was a huge swing because North Carolina for a long time was in the driver's seat, but it seems like he's going to still be in a spot that's going to fit him well, and that's ultimately a decision that I think both sides can live with. Now, the big question I think that a lot of people are going to have also is this it at linebacker? Do you think that they're still going to look at the possibility of bringing in one other guy that we've talked about a lot here on the podcast, as well as I've written about a lot on the blog? Do you think that Damian Wilson is still in play, or does this commitment take Damian Wilson out?
I don't think that it necessarily takes Damian Wilson out. I think the most important thing probably in this scenario is that there is less of a need for either Bryce Steele or Damian Wilson. Now that you have two, linebacker types as opposed to one, you sort of have flexibility. And I think, with the class as a whole, are at 14 at this point, kind of getting down to the final spots as it looks to be a smaller class. So, it's now time for the staff to sort of make those decisions and see, do we have a spot for you? Do we not have a spot for you in terms of that? And I think also I'm not entirely sure how, quick Damian Wilson is trying to make that commitment. I know that, from the Tar Heels perspective, if they've got a spot open for him and they're ready to take him with any prospect, they're going to be pushing to get that commitment as soon as possible. That's just how the Tar Heels staff operates. But I don't know, from his perspective, if he's looking to do that. I'm sure that he knows, if there's a spot open for him or not. I can't say one way or the other at this point with this new commitment, but I definitely think that door's still open. How long it'll be open, I can't say. I think with, him joining the Targo class, I think the biggest thing to keep in mind is just the time frame and the fact, there are going to be decisions at every position group that they're going to have to make going forward. They've been able to get at least one guy at almost every position group except for tight end at this point, which is a position they're still looking for. So, spots are limited. Will there be one for Damian Wilson now? Will there be one for Damian Wilson in the fall or winter? These are questions, that we don't have the answer to right now, and ultimately that's for him to answer.
Yeah, I think he's close to a decision. I think he's definitely got his top schools in mind. And I think one thing that's really interesting is when you look at the makeup of this team right now, I would say that tight end, like you mentioned, is probably a spot where I would be shocked if they don't bring a guy in at tight end. Now, the thing is there a guy already committed in the class that could be a tight end? We don't know. I mean, there have been so many mentions of where they could possibly play Caleb Hood. I don't think he has the size to play there. I being a guy that's a quarterback now that really thrives using his legs, I just don't see that being a fit for him. It also kind of depends on what a guy that's currently in the class does. Where does Jefferson Boaz go? Does he stick at quarterback or does he go over to tight end? Because that would add another freshman, meaning that they would have three guys from this past class as true freshmen coming in that are tight ends. I think that could play a big factor. If they want to bring in a tight end, there's two guys to keep an eye on. Miles Campbell out of the state of Georgia is one of the guys. And then, of course, Bryson Nesbitt, who's been a long-time target from right here in the Charlotte area. So I think that's an area that maybe you look at as a position in need. And I know I'm going to write an article on this and kind of go through and spend a little bit of time here once we get through, because there might still be another guy or two that might end up joining this wave. There's nothing concrete right now, but there are some rumors that there are some guys definitely thinking after today could end up committing sometime soon. So I'll hold off. But when you look at the other needs on this team, I don't really know if there is a huge need. I feel like they would like to probably add another running back in this class if they could, which is pretty much going to be reserved for Will Shipley. If they can get him to commit to Carolina, he would be a take no doubt, in my mind, one of the best prospects in the state, one of the best prospects in the entire country, and a guy that would add just a totally different element to your offense, being a guy that's compared to Christian McCaffrey, more often than not, especially in this area. And then also, I think that if Evan Pryor was to want to flip his commitment, that would be maybe another area. So running back is a spot where people might look to because if they can, I think they probably want to use DeAndre Boykins on the defensive side of the ball. Other than that, I mean, it's really far-fetched to find a position where they are dying for someone. It's more of if a guy was to commit, would they be willing to take his commitment? So I think linebacker is still a spot where you're kind of thin. You're still going to have guys that, in the 3 deep at least, that are going to be walk-ons because you just don't have the depth there just yet. So I think Wilson probably still is a take at this point. I think if he ends up committing there, Carolina would bring him in. He's another guy that's kind of trending up as we go along. 24/7 Sports released their latest rankings. He's a guy that continues to trend up. So there's a lot to like about him. A guy that is kind of the definition of a true inside linebacker. Really isn't a guy that's going to get out in coverage that often, but can come up, fill the gap real well. So I think it's going to be interesting. He's a name that is not going to disappear after today. If the Tar Heels were going to take both Dillworth and Steele, I think then Wilson would have been off the board. But I think you're right. He's still on the board as of right now. So let's move over, talk about Jared Wilson. His commitment kind of caught some people off guard. They didn't know that he was actually going to commit today. A lot of people thought, just from kind of reading into his social media post, that he was probably going to be close behind. They didn't know it would be seconds behind. That was actually pretty cool seeing Dillworth call him in, and he announced that he was committing to Carolina. And this is another big one. You want to talk about a guy that had some big-time schools going after him. I mean, some of the schools in his final group were schools like Georgia, he was originally committed to, and Carolina was one of the big factors as to why he ended up decommitting. Clemson was in there, as well as Florida, who was making a push for him, LSU. So some big-time players in there. Carolina ends up landing his commitment over those guys. And this guy is I mean, you want to talk about a guy that's going to come in with the size to be able to play already. He's big. I mean, he's 6'4", 325, so he won't have to put on any weight. And he has the size to play inside. He plays outside at the high school level, played offensive tackle since his senior year. He started every game for West Forsyth out there, and really has done a pretty good job. I still think that there are some questions about his lateral quickness. I think some of the faster guys in the ACC would really bother him if you had to put him all out at offensive tackle. But he's got really good upper body strength, and he's a guy that can just simply overpower guys. I think that fits exactly what the Tar Heels need inside, and he is athletic enough to still be able to pull block like the Tar Heels want to do with their offensive linemen. I'm assuming that you, being a guy that's really been around, focused on this class with us here on the podcast, you've been able to learn a lot about Jared Wilson. What'd you think about his commitment and his tape when you went back and watched it?
Well, like you said, I mean, he had a lot of guys that were on him, a lot of top schools, that we talk about often that were on him and wanted his signature, so much so that he was initially a Georgia commit, who then decommitted when former UGA offensive line coach Sam Pittman went to be the head coach of Arkansas. So, he was a guy that had legitimate interest from these big programs. And like you said, you put on that film and you can see it. He is an absolute mauler on the offensive line. Big, physical, really sort of plays with a mean streak, as they say. Like you said, plays offensive tackle in high school, will most likely move inside. I think that's probably his ultimate position, but really just a key pickup. A guy that I think is probably better than his current ranking as a 3-star. Based on what I've seen, without having the spring and summer camp circuit, that might sort of hurt that ranking going up. Right. But I think, for Tar Heel fans, they can definitely look at the film and then, as the years come by, look out and say, hey, this was a guy that could really be an impact player here.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely, of course, some technical things that they're going to work on with them, but I like, what you said, got sort of the mean streak to him, can really really has no problem putting even bigger defensive linemen on their back, and that's what I think helps with the size. And it's a position. The other thing that's really good about this, and this is a really talented guy as well, like you said. I mean, some sites have him as a 4-star. He's a 3-star. We go with 24/7 Sports composite rankings. So whenever we reference the star numbers, we're going with the composite rankings because that's the sum of all three. So that's how we go. But really, a talented guy. But the thing that I like the most about this is I think this is a guy that can use some time to develop, and he'll have that time to develop because the Tar Heels are not going to be dying for interior linemen. They've got a guy in Marcus McKeithen who's going to be there and looks like he's going to play a lot over these next couple of years because he's a really talented guy. He's not going anywhere after this year. Same thing, you've got Ed Montillis, Joshua Zudu, who rotated at the left guard position for most of last year. Billy Ross is behind them as well as a guy that started 13 games in the 2018 season. So Carolina has a lot of really good depth on the interior. Even if they need him at center, you've got Brian Anderson, who's still going to be there after this year. Ty Murray, who really shined in his limited snaps. So there's some time for him to grow, and I think that's the big thing. The other thing that I really like about this pickup is just from seeing him on social media, he's another one of those guys, kind of like Keyshawn Silver, who I think is going to have a big impact in terms of getting guys to campus, getting big-time recruits here, talking to guys like maybe a Tony Grimes, who's one of the top players in the country, but really likes to connect with some of the other guys and hear from them why it would be good to join them and become friends with them. So I think Jared Wilson is one of those guys that's going to help you not only when he gets to Carolina on the field, but when it comes to getting this class together. He's got that type of leadership feel to him, and I think that's going to be huge for Carolina. So, I mean, yeah, anything else, any other comments on these two guys today? I think a very successful day for the Tar Heels on the recruiting trail.
Yeah, I mean, one more thing real quick. As you mentioned, I mean, they did this essentially together. So that was really cool to see. I mean, it's one of the rare occasions that you get a sort of a double commitment. I don't think anyone had sort of an idea, obviously, except for the staff, that this was going to happen. And locally, these two guys are local enough that they were able to, get together and do this. So it was really cool to see. As we sort of, as we'll get into, I think when you have, two commitments like this, it really sort of builds that momentum that we've seen throughout the 2021 recruiting process so far, where the Tar Heels have gotten, a big commit or a big set of commits, and it's built this momentum. I mean, the more guys you add, that's, to put it one way, it's the more recruiters you're having. And like you mentioned, Raneiria Dillworth and Jared Wilson can be some key ones. And I think that really, starts to weigh on these, on the minds of these uncommitted prospects, specifically the ones in state, that look at, we've heard these promises or these goals from North Carolina of building a fence around the state or building a program with in-state players. And, here's just another point of example of here is the Tar Heel staff accomplishing that goal, but then also here are my friends that are, actively trying to get me to come with them, to be a part of this process and be a part of this movement within the Tar Heel state.
Yeah, and I mean, it's amazing to see the amount of talent that the Tar Heels have already gotten out of the state. This is a class that right now, according to 24/7 Composite Sports team ranking, is number 2 in the country, behind only Ohio State, who is putting together one of the best classes ever. Already a class that I believe, if I remember seeing this right the other day, would be in the top 5 of classes that just finished up in the 2020 class, and they only have 16 commitments. So they have landed some elite prospects there. But Carolina is still, they're still pretty far behind them. I don't know if they're going to catch them at number 1, but even to be number 2, this is unprecedented, especially with the fact that you think about where this program was when Mack Brown took over, and the fact that a lot of people were kind of afraid that this was going in the wrong direction. This was going to be a team that was going to kind of slip back into, from being, the team in 2015 that people saw and said, okay, they're finally looking like they've got some momentum with Larry Fedora. Maybe they can capitalize on what we've always heard, that they have the talent there. It's just they're that sleeping giant. And Mack Brown has immediately come in, put life back into the program, and now has this team fighting against some of the top teams in the country for prospects and has them in the top 5. I'm at number 2 right now. Nationally in recruiting, I think they'll probably stay somewhere up near the top there. I would be very shocked if this team falls out of the top 10. At this point, probably the top 5 in these classes. And one of the big things that we always talk about when you talk about teams that have the ability to make the college football playoff and win the national championship, you have to be able to recruit. Again, we're not trying to say that this is a team that is ready to go win a national championship this year or next year or maybe even the year after that. But if you're going to get there, you have to be able to recruit, and Carolina's doing it right now. Of course, the class now also ranked number 1 in the ACC. They've actually jumped over Clemson, and that is saying something considering that Clemson is coming off their best class in program history back in 2020. Carolina is really making some strides, and it's getting a lot of people to think. And some of those guys that are thinking and kind of wonder who could be next, guys like Javari Ritzy, a guy that is a teammate of Raneiria Dillworth, has been a long-time target for the Tar Heels, and is a guy that is needed. Carolina could use another defensive end in this class. It's not a huge need like we talked about, really. There are only 1, maybe 2 significant needs left in this class. Carolina's done a great job the last 2 classes on the defensive line, but he's a guy that you could talk about. Peyton Page is a guy that is interesting because he's seen a substantial drop in the rankings over these last couple of weeks, but is still a highly sought-after prospect and released his top 3 the other night. Now looked at as a guy that's probably going to be committing here sometime soon. Could he potentially be that next guy that joins? Damian Wilson, who we talked about, and there's also some other guys. So when you look at some of these big-time names that are still out there for the taking, I mean, do you feel like any of them are close to popping in your mind, or do you think it's still going to be a little bit of a waiting period?
Yeah, I think that there are reasons to feel that some of these guys might pop, pretty soon, and there's reasons to feel like, that they might wait a little bit. I mean, you start with really the biggest one that you mentioned, in Javari Ritzy, another Forsyth County guy, actually, like Jared Wilson and Ra Dillworth, and teammates with Raneiria Dillworth. So in terms of reasons that I think that he could jump on sooner rather than later, it's having those local connections. It's having those guys that he's had that, connection with. He's got a teammate now. So someone, right there in his high school that's, another elite commit, another guy in his ear saying, hey, come to Chapel Hill, come play for Matt Brown, come be a Tar Heel. So I feel that factor, plays a big role. And, now it's kind of like the pressure's on him to join that movement. If there's any factor that would lead me to think that he would wait, it's that was really, the consensus idea from his recruitment before now is that he was looking to take additional visits. He wanted to go, to places like South Carolina, like Georgia, like Tennessee, see all those programs, really go through the full recruitment process before, making his announcement. So it's kind of still up in the air just because he, before today, was pretty adamant about, I'm going to take my visits, I'm going to stay pretty open, but you never know when you have these sort of local connections. Another guy that you mentioned, also sort of in the triad area of in Greensboro there, Peyton Page, announced his top 3, Clemson, Tennessee, and, of course, North Carolina. Could he be a prospect that's kind of feeling that same thing? Obviously not the Forsyth County sort of connection that I mentioned, but, local buzz, more guys in the state, that are probably in his ear about joining the Tar Heels. So, that could be one. We've seen pretty stiff competition there from both Clemson and Tennessee. It seems like Clemson kind of has the inside track. So if there's anything that would lead me to believe that maybe it's not having the impact, it's the prior relationship with Clemson and that sort of momentum up until this point. One more guy I wanted to mention, which if you keep up with these guys on social media, kind of saw some of it today, is a wide receiver out of Reidsville, North Carolina, Breon Pass, a 3-star in-state wide receiver. Seems like he has some interest in the class, so could be some movement there, obviously, with 2 wide receivers from in the state committed, and Gavin Blackwell and Kobe Pacehour. Could be looking at another one within the, Longo offense. You're looking to use multiple wide receivers, 3 to 4 wide receivers, in any given play. So always looking to add wide receivers. That could be another in-state guy that's, saying, look, there's limited spots. I don't know how many wide receiver spots are left. Let me come join this class while there's still a spot available to me.
And Pass is really interesting because he has been hinting at some stuff on social media that leaves me to believe that he is going to probably have to make a decision between basketball and football. And Breon Pass, I've seen some of his highlight tape. He's a really good basketball player. I was kind of wondering for a while there because his commitment has kind of been, or recruitment, has kind of been very quiet. And I was wondering if maybe he was looking into the possibility of finding a school where he can kind of play both, get scholarships from both. But I don't know if maybe that just isn't kind of working out. But I don't know. I mean, I think that this is definitely something that's interesting for him. One thing that's kind of weird about the wide receiver position is it's kind of hard to get a read on which guy the Tar Heels are really trying to hone in on because there's pretty much four of them that come to mind when you talk about that position. And I am of the belief that they are going to probably take on another wide receiver in this class, mainly because when you look at Gavin Blackwell, smaller guy, Kobe Paysauer, a little bit smaller than you may realize. So guys that if you had to play them on the outside, you'd feel you could, but you'd feel more comfortable if you had a guy with a little bit of a bigger frame, which kind of fits the outside a little more typically because you're looking for those guys that are kind of 6'3", 6'4", like Bo Corrales, like De'Ami Brown are right now. And that's where some of these other guys are going to come into play. Breon Pass is one of those guys. I don't think he's up in that range, but is a guy that, just from when I saw him when he played against East Surrey earlier this year when I scouted that game, can go up and get the football, is a really talented player. Then you've got a guy out of Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, who just announced his top 10. Carolina was a part of it. Is now a guy that's really trending up in terms of a lot of the recruiting rankings. Just became a 4-star according to 24/7 Sports, still a composite 3-star, but should end up moving up whenever some of these other sites update their rankings. That's J.J. Jones, who's been talked about a lot. Now, the thing about him is been linked a little bit more, of course, to South Carolina because he's got the connection to a guy that just committed in that class this past year, Luke Doughty, who is his quarterback at Myrtle Beach High School. Also has a good connection with West Virginia, but Carolina is still pushing for him as well. And then there's a couple other guys who took some big-time drops in the last rankings from 24/7 just the other day in both Michael Crowell, who's an in-state guy, missed all of last season with a knee injury, but a talented guy, got a big frame, can go up and get the football, but is still a guy that's kind of seen as more of an after-the-catch type guy than he is a go up and get it. Has that ability, but doesn't do it often. And then James Blackstrain was another name that we heard. Remember, he was supposed to take a visit to campus in late February before everything, of course, got canceled. Late March before everything got canceled. He ended up kind of having to just, cancel everything, all the visits. Still plans on taking a visit to Carolina. So those are the four guys to keep an eye on there. I think some of the stuff that you mentioned with Ritzy was interesting. He's kind of confusing though because anytime you see he'll start talking about a school a lot. Carolina's gotten it a couple of times. NC State's gotten it a couple of times. You think, okay, maybe he's close to making a commitment because he's on here every day talking to guys. Well, then he doesn't end up making a commitment. He just keeps, kind of keeping his stuff under wraps. So the good news is he has a top 5 in place, so that's at least something. But at the same time, it still seems like he's a guy that might end up holding out. I'll put you on the spot here just really quick. If there's a guy that commits in this class next, who would you think it is?
I think it would be one of two prospects. I think it would be Ritzy if it's going to be anyone, just because, as we're whittling down the list of prospects, there's only so many left.
Right.
That can commit. So of the ones that I think would be the most likely. I think it would be Ritzy. If I had to list another name, it would be the wide receiver, out of Myrtle Beach, J.J. Jones, that you mentioned. Obviously has that South Carolina connection, has the West Virginia connection. But as you mentioned, more likely than not, the Tar Heels want to add a bigger, true outside receiver in this class. He really fits that mold, probably the best out of any prospect they still have on the board. So, while I'm not there with a stat, I think he'd probably be at the top of their wide receiver board, if not near the top. So I could see him being an option here soon. But, I'll ask you the same thing. Is there anyone else that you think is really, looking to potentially make that move and join this Tar Heel class?
So Ritzy, I'm going to keep him up there, but I've been saying that for a couple of months now. I still think that he's right on the border of committing to Carolina. I think now maybe with Dillworth committed, I think maybe that was part of the holdup, was he was going to see if Dillworth went somewhere where maybe he felt like he could have an impact as well. Now he's at a spot where he would be able to, and that's one of the teams that he has a really good relationship with. So I'll still keep him up there. The other guy that's really interesting that I don't think enough people are talking about, and I think he could jump on now that they just got another offensive lineman to commit in this class, is Colby Smith, the 4-star offensive tackle out of out of Rockingham County High School in West End, North Carolina. He just released his top 5 last night, but it feels like he's getting pretty close to that point. I still think that there's some competition. Tennessee's in there as well. In Tennessee, you can see that they're starting to sort of make a little bit of an impact in the state because Peyton Page has them in there. There's been a couple other guys who have been considering Tennessee, as well as another guy that's an in-state player that ended up committing there at the defensive tackle position in Isaac Washington, who goes to East Surrey High School, which is where the Tar Heels did a lot of work this past class. So I think that's one team to keep an eye on with him. NC State as well, because they're an in-state school and have gained just a little bit of momentum. But I still think that Carolina has really shown that they are the team to play for in this state. He's one of the state's top prospects, and Carolina is always looking for those athletic offensive tackle types. That's what Colby Smith is. I think that with another offensive lineman committing in this class, now there's 2 guys here, and the last 2 classes Carolina has brought in 9 combined guys. I feel like he may realize that, hey, there might not be too many offensive line spots open in this class. He might jump on. So Colby Smith is the other guy to keep an eye on, but I'll go and say Ritzy is the next guy to commit, but you just never really know with him. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about just before we get out of here, just wanted to touch on it really quick, and I'd like to get your opinion on it as well. Avery Jones, a redshirt freshman from this past year on the offensive line, he entered the transfer portal today. That kind of slipped under the radar with everything that was going on in terms of the football commitments, as well as Cole Anthony declaring for the NBA draft from the basketball team. But, this is, not a huge loss for Carolina, but it is something significant just because this was a former 4-star offensive guard prospect, a guy that came from Havelock High School, a place where Carolina's got some really good ties there. Of course, they got Wilton Spotsfell, who's on the roster right now as part of the 2019 class that was from there. And, of course, the Tar Heel running back commit in this class, Kamaro Edmonds, is from Havelock. He ends up going and entering the transfer portal, though, Avery Jones does. Really only saw action in 1 game his entire career at Carolina, although it was only 2 years, redshirted the first. Saw action last year for 1 snap against Mercer, but ends up moving on. I don't think it's really too much of a big deal. Of course, we wish Avery Jones the best, and I still think he's a talented guy that has a future somewhere. But Carolina, as I mentioned, 9 commitments along the offensive line in the last 2 classes. Still talk about a group that only lost 1 starter starter from this past year, also returns a couple of guys, as we talked about, whether it's Ed Montilus or Joshua Zudu who starts. One of those guys will be coming off the bench, and then there's, of course, Billy Ross, who has the experience from starting in 2018, who's still back there and can help you if needed. I don't think it's a huge concern. It also helps that in the 21 class, you landed a guy at offensive guard today. But what did you think about the news that Avery Jones was transferring?
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly a situation worth the perjury of, just with him being a former four-star, like you mentioned. It's obviously, it seemed like he really had an interest in playing here, so you sort of feel for him that he feels the need to move on. In terms of the Tar Heels situation on the offensive line, I don't believe that he was in the too deep. So it's not really any sort of depth loss. And then, looking at the offensive depth as a whole, they really have 16 scholarship guys on the offensive line right now, including, the incoming true freshmen that should be there in the fall. And none of them are rising seniors or redshirt seniors. So, potentially you can have all 16 of these guys back the next year. Now, more likely than not, that won't happen. Obviously, they're recruiting guys in this 2021 class. Guys may elect to go early to the NFL if that is potentially an option for any of them this year. One or two more might transfer. That's always an option when you're sort of, involved in this roster construction in college football. But it's really something that you just you wish the best for the kid and hope that he finds, an opportunity that he feels best for him and best for his athletic and academic career. And, one that I don't think will be too much of a concern for this Tar Heel staff or Tar Heel personnel.
All right, and so that wraps up an action-packed edition of the Heel Tough Blog podcast. Again, thanks for coming on with us tonight. I know everything's been a little bit crazy, but I know you wanted to get on here and talk about these guys, and I'm glad you were able to do it with us, man.
Yeah. Yet again, thanks for having me. Like I said, each time, it seems like we've been coming on here more and more, but that's just the state of Tar Heel recruiting these days. It's a new guy, everywhere you look. So always glad to be here and always glad to talk some Tar Heel recruiting.
And there is potentially more excitement on the horizon these next couple of days. Some of these other major targets could end up choosing to jump on. We don't know anything yet. There's no other scheduled commitments, as we told you, besides Bryce Steele's tomorrow. And as of right now, we're not going to put you guys on commitment watch for that one. It really feels like he's probably going to go and go south to South Carolina. But we'll have you covered, of course, here on the podcast and on the Heel Tough Blog website if anybody else jumps on. And of course, head over to the Heel Tough Blog website. That's where we've got both of the commitment articles for you. They're actually one article. It's combined, so we got Dillworth and Wilson both in there. We have a breakdown of both players, what we see on film or what I see on film from them, as well as also their stats from high school, just so you can get a feel. Dillworth, amazing. I did want to mention that, and I just remember that now. 198 total tackles this past year as a junior. So nearly 200 total tackles in one season. Only played 14 games, too. This wasn't a team that made a run all the way to the state championship game either. So the Tar Heels are getting a volume tackler in that as well. So that's really, really encouraging to see. So make sure you guys head over to the website, check that out. Of course, we've got you covered with everything else. I've got the Avery Jones article up there as well. You guys can go ahead and read that. As I mentioned, we'll have the adjusted needs article for the Tar Heels, give you the biggest needs remaining in the class of 2021. It's going to be an interesting read because we're going to have to do a little bit of digging and kind of make some tough decisions to see which position we think maybe needs a little more attention than the others, because the Tar Heels have done such a great job of addressing any of the needs that they have in this class already. So that'll be up there. And then, of course, for basketball, we've got you covered with everything that's going on. There are some big-time commitments expected. Dontrez Styles, the 2021 four-star guard, is expected to make his commitment sometime tomorrow. And then we will also have you covered whenever Kerwin Walton makes his decision, which is expected to be either Friday or Saturday of next week. I don't remember the exact date. I know it's the 24th or the 25th. So we'll have you covered with all of that. And, of course, we got the article up there now that you can go and read on Cole Anthony going to the NBA. So we got you covered with all that. HeelToughBlog.com is where you can check all that out. As for the podcast, make sure that you guys, if you could, rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Rate and review, that's to try to get us moving up some of the rankings. Really just on Apple, Google Podcasts, Spotify, places like that. And the reason that we ask you to do that is so that we can get some more people that can join in and listen to the show and listen to all this great content that we have. You know, you guys are listening to this now. There are some Tar Heel fans out there who really don't, maybe don't know about this yet. So if you rate and review, the podcast is able to move up in the rankings. There are so many great Tar Heel podcasts that it's hard to compete, and we kind of get buried. So if you guys rate and review it, we'll move up. And then, of course, the subscribe is for you so that you don't miss any edition of the podcast. We're going to be doing, of course, more of these recruiting podcasts whenever we end up landing commitments, or if we've got a big one coming up, we'll, of course, do that. And then, of course, we have all the great interviews that we've been doing, the quarantine interview series. We're not even halfway through the library of interviews that we've got. There's some great ones coming up with former Tar Heels, all the way from recent guys like Jake Lawler, who stopped by not only to talk about his Tar Heel football career, but movies as well. Even go back into the 90s with quarterback Chris Kildorf. Went back into the 80s with quarterback Scott Stankiewicz. And then even all the way back into the 70s, James Betterson joined us as well. So you don't want to miss any of those coming up. Make sure that you subscribe so that you don't miss a single episode. So once again, want to thank Zack Hubbard for joining me tonight. Want to thank you guys for listening. And lastly, we want to tell all of the healthcare workers out there that we appreciate you so much here on the podcast. Make sure that you guys show your support for all of the healthcare workers who are working through this right now. While we're at home, they're putting their lives on the line to keep us safe. So make sure you stay safe, stay home, and go Tar Heels.